Ja, dat heb je in elke universiteit in Europa.
Live! Werkt het? Kun je me zien?
Maar de rode vraag is dan, wat is dat interessante kind?
Wauw.
Super. Je gaat een mooi herkennen als Jakob vervangen wordt. Dan weet je 7. Dat is 7.
Oh. En kijk je kritisch, dan heb je jou dit eigenlijk staan. Ja, toch? Maar dat vind ik compleet. In die conclusie, dan moet dan niet staan. Eigenlijk maar is het goed. Nee, maar ik heb nog niet staan van hoe dit er niet kan.
Jij kan mij zien, dat is positief. Hoi, ja? Oh, zie je dit trouwens? Dan loopt hij echt minstens 30 seconden achter. Nee, interessant. Dat is niet zo'n probleem. De vraag is vooral even, ik ga mijn presentatie op het scherm zetten. En dan moet je dus, hoop ik, en mijn presentatie kunnen zien en mij kunnen zien. Wauw. Ja. Ja, waarschijnlijk blijft hij in Japan. Wie, dat maakt echt zo lang.
Is er niet eentje die we moeten betalen?
Oké, je ziet mij niet meer. Ik ga even mijn mobiel uitzetten en het geluid presentatie aan, om even te kijken of je dat kan horen. Dan kun je me in ieder geval wel verstaan zometeen. Joep.
Nee.
Nee. Dat is niet best. Ze hadden een heel hip console daar neergezet. Met allemaal audio natuurlijk. Dat was niet zo.
Ik kan er dus zitten. Wil jij hier nog even doorlezen op fiets?
Dat is niet zo erg geleden.
Oh, je hoort het. Als ik van mezelf.
Ja.
Maar misschien kunnen we de vraag stellen waar gespeeld in dat identiteit. Zeg maar, ik wil het wist hebben wat het niet voor de stad.
Oké, jij hebt gelijk. Dan.
Dan hoeven we niet te gaan met de identiteit.
Ja, oké. Hij loopt nog wel een seconde of 15 achter dan, want hij zegt hoe het hier gaat. Maar ik kan hier niet van de wifi af. Dus ik denk dat we even. Ik laat het gewoon opstaan en dan ga ik het even doen.
Soms zijn die vragen.
Wat zeg je? Nee, waarschijnlijk krijg je dan alleen maar een presentatie. Dan moet je het maar even zonder mijn hoofd doen, helaas. Top. Yes. Jo, dankjewel. Hi. Er zijn wat mensen die dat hebben geprobeerd met het onderzoek van Business Informatics.
Wat zei je?
Er zijn wat mensen die dat hebben geprobeerd. Ja, consultancybedrijven zijn begonnen met z'n tweeën op dit onderwerp. Ja, dat is niet heel erg veel indruk, maar ja. Nee.
Het is wel echt mooi.
En hier van dat voor niet wetenschappelijk. Ja. Nou, dit is een heel mooi lijstje op video. Dit zijn uitkomsten van het onderzoek. Nou, dus van die rookgranaat. Hier ontstaat het eigenlijk al nergens op.
Ja, maar hoe past dit nu binnen de nationale wetenschapsagenda?
Dat kan ik daadwerkelijk aan. Ik weet niet of ik ga zeggen, maar het past binnen de wetenschapsagenda van mijn opleiding. Aangezien wij kunnen aannemen dat mijn opleiding geaccrediteerd is en dus binnen de nationale wetenschapsagenda past.
Nee.
Jawel.
Mijn opleiding is geaccrediteerd tot zijn universitair niveau. Dus mijn afstudeeronderzoek voldoet aan het nationale wetenschapsagenda.
Ik heb hier gewoon Master of Science van.
Nou, zeker minder waar. Dat moet niet begrijpen.
Wat gaat dan?
Je kan
Val mee. Papa, mama kan nog. Mijn begeleider komt nog.
Singer.
Ja, Kalter. Jullie komt nog. Rudy komt blijkbaar niet. Aangezien ik hem daar geworden. Ja, dat is niet gedaan.
Nou, als je die in de auto stapt, dan lukt het niet. En dan wel nog in een dankwoord.
Ja, de laatste paragraaf. De paragraaf die gaat
staat van,
als ik
dit
je
is-
vergeten ben, sorry. Hè?
Heb je daar leuk gevonden?
Ja.
Nee, ik zeg voordat ik hier op het lijstje lopen.
Tot maand 4 was het wel leuk. Daarna werd het wat minder. Daarna heb ik heel groot op mijn blaadje geschreven. Uitzoeken wat Slinger eigenlijk echt wil en dat vertellen we over.
Ja,
Een beetje een principle.
ik heb dat al eens genoemd door de voetbal te springen. Dat ik het idee had dat ik voor mij had weer voetbal te kunnen springen, zeg maar.
Je hebt wel eens het gevoel van dat de hoepels dan verplaatsen tussen
Ja.
de sessies die je met zo'n begeleiden.
Time very in voetbal, zeg maar.
Ik heb 1 keer een bespreking met Slinger gehad. Dat was echt zo op een gegeven moment van iets van. Ja, ik had eigenlijk verwacht dat je door deze kant moet gaan, dat je dit en dit en dit op een gegeven moment niks zal opleveren. Dus van, waar komt dit vandaan? Dat ging heel goed.
Dit klinkt dus bekend. Ik hoor dit zoveel van al die afsturingen dat iedereen. Jakob, wat doe je voetbal?
De terugval aan ingaan? Dat is midden. Vanuit ingang gewoon gelijk aan.
Maar je wordt ook ieder bij zijn studieresultaat.
Let op. Ja, een organisatie toedenken.
Ja, hoe ben je gekomen buiten op of
Die jongen komt uit Leiden. Daar zijn we gewoon niet zo. Kijk, het is waar. Leiden heeft in de binnenstad allerlei universiteitsgebouwen zitten. Nog wat zitten.
Die allerlei ook gesteld.
Ja, nou, er zitten ook vooral studenten in. Nee, maar.
In Amsterdam leer je dus zelfstandigheid en opstandigheid als student.
Nee, dat is wel waar. Amsterdam is het. Die zijn continu die altijd bezig met de maatschappij en dat ze het niet mee eens zijn. Dat is echt waar hoor. Ik werk in mijn VVD ook wel.
Maar je hebt ook Amsterdammers en Nederlanders.
Ja.
Een beetje een soort verdeling.
Als je in Amsterdam iets zit, dan is je wel anders.
Ja,
Als we dit maken, is het ook niet een presentatie.
Dat is niet heel.
Overwege in presentatie zie je zo dat die beamer daar gehackt wordt in de mars. Dan komen we erin en ik weet niet wat er dan voor mij komt.
Hey, maar even plan, we krijgen de presentatie van een half uur.
50 minuten.
Dan moeten wij nog vragen stellen.
15 minuten voor vragen. Moet dat wel iets uitlopen. Dan krijg je cijfers goed is. Of niet goed is, dan
mag je nog een keer.
op je 8 maanden. Dat moet je wel zien. Want eigenlijk heb ik het een 7 gedaan blijkbaar. Ik kon niet tellen. Dus ik heb nog een maand. Die ik niet van plan dat daar wordt gaan gebruikt.
Dus ik moet zeggen, als je nu tot een uur komt, je nog makkelijk uit, dan is dat misschien een vraag voor de klant.
Dat je ook hier vragen onder dingen.
Kom ik ook nog een maandje op terug.
Mijn docent had ook de hobby om nooit langer dan 2 e-mails terug te lezen in een conversatie. Dus af en toe moet ik ook herinneren aan de conversatie wat er daarvoor is gebeurd. Zo op de conversatie van de eerste afstudeerdatum ben, krijg ik ook afgelopen maandag een mailtje met: ja, had ik jouw thesis eigenlijk al goedgekeurd? Mag je al presenteren? Dus dan mag je daar een soort van vanuit, want je hebt niet geprotesteerd toen ik inderdaad verlikte. Dus ja, zo daar weer bij.
Ik heb een keer gevraagd.
Toen kwam je er 1 stel af. Ja.
Probleem met 2 minuten geleden. Dat wij al makkelijk. Oké, nou ja, dan willen we 28 september gaan doen. Zoiets als het verhaal van 1 september. Zo, we hebben nog niet over groen licht.
Ach jongens, dat is allemaal niet nodig.
Ik zie mij trouwens dat er nu in de beamer zo staat dat ik al, ze kunnen al dit trouwens ook horen, dat ik het gelijk niet uitzet. Dat ik al 10 minuten lang brood sta in de beamer.
Ik heb daar lijf eens ook mee. Zo goed bij ook.
Nee.
De koffieautomaat naast de.
Ja,
dat is heel erg sterk.
Ja, er zijn mensen die gewoon zo snel zijn.
Ga je niet op.
Er zijn mensen die zo snel zijn. Maar dat voor betreft waar mensen die gewoon echt niet
Zo kun je even vragen stellen.
Ja, een soort van nee, wel.
Die koffieautomaat daar niet zo de reden waarom ik niet koffie tegenkomen. Dat is een goede reden om te denken van, oh, eigenlijk is het een beetje waar.
Koffieautomaten zijn op de U-verkaal. Dus de volgende koffieautomaat staat eigenlijk al bij letterlijk boven. Dan gaan we niet omhoog.
Nou, dat is en dat is op zich best logisch.
Ja.
Het is makkelijk, want het is alleen maar de waterleiding omhoog doen. Ik denk dat het zo, als je een beetje gemotiveerd bent, in ieder geval heel makkelijk dat te rijden van de kazerne.
Bij de halfwaard bedoel je?
Nee, in maar mijn demo waar ik dan onderdeel waar zit, wil men heel graag naar de kazerne plaatsen. Nou, je zegt, de ambtelijk tot wil dat, de rest van de mensen wil dat niet. Maar de secretaris-generaal van het ministerie heeft gezegd dat het ging gebeuren. Dus het gaat gebeuren.
En nu is maar een
Ik krijg straks een telefoontje. Zeg, ja, die
dat was ook nog
afstudeer.
erger. Tussen dat verhaal dat ik net vertelde was het ook nog van. Ja, je hebt je afstudeerdatum gewerkt, maar dat is een paddenbaan. Dus ik kan niet. Dus moet je het plaatsen. Jij hebt de datum gekozen. Welke datum is het? Die. Oh, verkeerde datum, laat maar. Nee, dat is niet naast.
Afghanistan buitenop.
Het is wetenschappen, maar half eind met de.
Hoi, er is een werk hier buitenop. Waarom is het niet even?
Dat is een gaswet.
Ik had in de tijd een hele collegezaal van zoiets.
Ja, ik had gezegd, er komen 10 mensen.
Een complete collegezaal.
Die zou niet goed.
Jawel, maar van ja, dit soort dingen.
Nee, dat is zo. Maar er zijn mensen op de live feed die zo kunnen kijken. Dat wil ik mij leuk weten. Zeg maar, ik heb nu stickers geplakt. Ik mag van hier staan. Dit is het midden. Tot hier. Maximaal hier. Dat sta ik Kijk hoe misschien als Arnoud er was geweest.
Misschien.
Je weet wat ik allemaal mee heb genomen. Ik heb zelfs een Bluetooth headset bij me voor als ik niet verstaan kan.
Maar je had wel 30 seconden. Ja,
Het is ook wel een essentieel iets dat.
die zou niet eens zeggen. We moeten natuurlijk ook van op YouTube live doen.
Ik luister.
Oh, dan gaan we even kun je opzetten en dan even kijken hoe ver ik hier vanaf
Maar
nu
ik vind
vraag.
dan jouw beeldscherm wel weer een beeld van de camera hier plaatsen. Zodat het goed wordt.
Ik kan het niet mergen helaas. Dus je kunt niet en mij zien en de slide zien. Dus alles weg hebt aan elkaar.
Zie je hier wat kleiner?
Nee, ik heb helaas alleen camera.
Oké, ik heb nu mezelf erop gezet.
Ik zie alleen je staan.
Ja, hij loopt achter, maar.
Ik denk nu nog niet heel.
Nu is het kennen. Ja, zoveel loopt hij achter.
Maar je ziet zo net op, we doen dan die YouTube-servers.
Ja, moet ik
Dan eerst langs de NEC. Nou, ik heb nu mezelf opgezet, niet uitgezet. Dus zou nu mij niet kunnen zien.
maar.
Het duurt alleen een minuut. Ja, ik zit toch even. Of hopelijk alle wijzen doen naar. Dan wordt het maar slides naar voren.
Het is wel heel helder te verstaan. Maar horen wij ons of horen wij het zo?
Als het goed is, had ik het zo suppressed. Dat is al goed.
Kan dat ook dan? Zo.
Ja, kan van iedereen suppressen die binnenkomt.
Maar kunnen mensen.
Oh, als je de Google Hangouts Q&A hebt, mag je zo meteen een vraag stellen.
Ja, maar het is wel gek uit. Grappig nog. Maar de YouTube, dat ik heeft gepost.
Maar is dat dan ook via die hangout? Of is dat dan nog?
Ja, het is gewoon, zeg maar, je kan een Google Hangout joinen hier. Dan kun je meepraten, je camera aanzetten. Zo al heb ik ook maar uitgezet dat er niemand mee mag doen. En het wordt gewoon live gefeed naar YouTube. Waarschijnlijk heeft dat dus vertraging, want we moeten eerst voor Google Plus en Hangout. Ja, nee, je hoort alleen jezelf. De socials niet in Hangout. Dus de helft van de socials niet.
Ja, dat is maar zo uitgehangen. En rondvallen. Maar je moet het bij. Dat gaat niet op.
WhatsApp.
Ja, ik ben het zo erg aan met een lange weg. Dus je kan
Zijn
gewoon.
12:49. Slinger Jansen, de eerste begeleider. Waar moet ik heen?
Nou, wij kunnen wel even open zijn.
Ja, ik zijn zeer eigenlijk.
We hebben nog een keer.
Bij de afdeling. Die maakte dan een soort sporthal om altijd zo laat binnen te komen dat iedereen dacht, komt die man nog wel? En ik kwam niet. Ik wil beginnen. En dan zeg maar, hij wil je hebt die level hij was gewoon zeker. En dan vervolgens probeer je zelf de hemel in de pijn te houden en dan is dat niet meer. Dan sta je ook nog uit bij af.
Ja, ja. Als we dit net wel van boer doen, jou wel. Die komen altijd binnenlopen en kon die gewoon meteen tekenen en vieren en vast aan. Gewoon een plan doen, meteen ergens die naam naar voren.
Maar van boer was een hele cute, super goed docent.
Ik kan niet weten dat
Die ik heb het gehoord dat hij aan boer komt op altijd, nadat hij dus al met pensioen was, dat hij nog iedere ochtend om 8 uur zit. Maar natuurlijk wel. Ja, dat is wel apart. Omdat ik is in de weekend.
maar die ex-keuken, die mijn nu 2 dagen in pensioen, maar wordt weer voor 2 dagen in de week ook gedaan. Waarna iedereen denkt, oké, je bent nu dus voor je werk straks 2 dagen in de week. En die andere 2 dagen, die dagen die nu waarschijnlijk ook, toch? Toch?
Zei die, ja.
Zeiden ja, maar ja,
Ik denk dat het als professor heel lastig afzet is.
oh ja, dat is
Dan is iedereen zo afhankelijk
als je niet meteen hebt, dan zit het ook gewoon lucht. Ik ben niet graag maar ga je dat nou mee? Ja, we gaan het wel doen. Het is best niet vermoeiend en bepaalde ik kan de vraag zeker niet beantwoorden. Sleutel in onze ochtend. Apple. Dit snel. Oh, wat? Ja, dan denk ik ook wel waar.
Ja, dat is waar.
Dat vind ik een goede motivatie.
Ja, dat is ja. Ja, nee, dat is
ik vind het wel leuk hoor, ik ben een hele lichte die lening, maar zelf Vintage. Thermo.
ja, dat is wel veel, maar
Kun je afvragen waarom we dit willen?
ja, dat is wel.
Maar is het nou een soort van ja, maar er is wat ingehouden dat je ook in gestudeerd wordt. Veel podcasts gestudeerd. Ik denk dat mijn presentatie dus 0 beeld. Niet gespeeld op de speelde is alleen.
Dat is stijf meteen. Jammer dat Jaak niet is. Jaak laat kwam, dan was ik zeker begonnen. Want die klaagt altijd over. Jongen, je bent laat, komen niet meer in. Dat is echt vol maar in.
Ja, precies. Hij zegt, ik kom er gat in. Dat is hier vast. Het zit niet aan de afstand. Dit is als je wil voor wat?
Ik ben blij dat mensen in de social allemaal massaal aan het opletten zijn wat voor YouTube hoe je het allemaal gebeurt. Ik hoop dat Christian van de social.
Wauw, er zijn wel dingen.
Ja, dat is heel leuk.
Ja, er wordt geschilderd vooral.
Dit wordt ook een beetje hier.
Ja, maar best wel best.
Heel een installatie. Het ziet er super leuk uit hoor. Precies, waar je die theemootjes hebt op die stapels weer. Maar hoe lang gaan dat dingen voor?
Heb je er al geslagen?
We hebben getest in de studio om 6 maar wel echt onmiddellijk de snelheid mee dan naar beneden. Is dat goed? En dan gaan we hoe laat is het? Maar die basis niet heel vaak in. Dus het gevolg daarvan is dat ik vooral. Ja, precies niet zo.
Ja, maar er gaat natuurlijk gebeuren dat we ook een kwart niet aan het buisje.
Ja, nee, dan is het waar. Dan kunnen we dus niet doen. Maar uiteraard wat tegen de problemen zitten. Zoals dat de missingen en dat zijn 4 tegen
Ja, hoeveel heb je ook niet over?
De vervangingswaarde van het ding is ongeveer €300 denk ik. Nee.
De nieuwe is duur.
Ja, niet zo goed.
protector op zit of zo.
Ja, dat is dus tempered glass. Dus een screen protector, zeg maar zoals je vroeger van de beste dingen had. Maar deze is daadwerkelijk wel fijn glad en niet zo stroef. Dat is wel een verbetering.
Maar is het ook zo dat die ook beschermd tegen het groen gooien van je telefoon? Want dat doe ik zeg maar 1 keer in de zoveel. 1 keer in de maand ongeveer.
Ik heb het 1 keer gedaan met mijn mobieltje, dit keer de RW vallen. En zo vanaf de RW. Ja, dat was weg. Opslag. Tom. Zeg zo, pats. Dan denk je, oh, dat heeft hij al dat is mooi. Dan denk je, zak, 5 seconden uit. Pats.
Maar we kunnen, je hebt dus ook mensen die kopen een telefoon die tegen alles kan.
En nou daadwerkelijk,
Die gaan wel een
wees mee.
Ja, dat heb ik gezien. Ja, ik ook. Voor echt een idee hoor. Als je goed, ben je al goed? Nee, ik ben niet goed. Hij is al klaar. Kun je het cijfer? Dat kan ik niet.
De mening is.
Hoeveel lekkers heb je?
Er was een foto van.
4 krijgen.
Ja, 4
Nee. Maar ik heb het in vereniging opgezet. Voor mensen die daar bezig moeten zijn. Waarschijnlijk ook nog mensen bij Exact die kijken. Maar ik.
Ze zijn compleet?
Ja, ik verwacht hier niet nog meer.
Wil je telefoon ook terug?
Ja, graag. Dat wil ik wel graag terug.
Ik denk niet hier waar allemaal uit elkaar zetten.
Misschien is je aanzet.
We moeten opeens die normen maken.
Dat doen ze van. Dat zal niet de eerste keer zijn.
Het begint zo met e-mails of wat ergens van afstellen.
Ja.
Zal ik je aanzeggen?
Ja, dat is ja. Ik ga even timer aanzetten. Muziek aan. Kijk, wat dan muziek.
Alright, nou, welkom to the al plat staan. Ik ben Serians, ik ben docent onderzoeker hier bij informatiekunde en hou me bezig met het masterprogramma. We staan hier vandaag voor het leuke 50 jaar afstuderen. Einde van de tijdperk. Ja, dat gaat ook. De bedoeling is dat je de installatie mag je in Nederland doen zo lang er geen ontsprekingen in zou willen woont.
Ik zou voelen dat Engels spreken in 1000.
Oh, dan is het hartstikke Engels. En het mag van doen is zoals met 2 docenten, maar 1 docent
deze hetzelfde jaar naar de zon. Of helemaal. Ik zeg ja, zo'n een half uur. Dan is er 10 minuten voor vragen. Dan zou ik voorstellen dat een aantal publiek daar ook een discussie mee doet. Want ik ken het verhaal eigenlijk goed. Wel een paar vragen met een ket Jakob vast. Je kent mijn verhaal. Dan Max voor de toegang naar de commissie. Want de mooiste dat ik de commissie in één keer doe maar Jakob. Dan kom ik terug met het cijfer en waarschijnlijk een hard door. Maar we zullen het zien. Het gebeurt niet vaak. Goed, alright, dus we kunnen nog starten. Half uur, dan 10 minuten misschien is dan voor de
2 uur komt er iemand aanbellen dat hij graag wil verbouwen hier. Dus.
Zo ziet het vanmiddag. Oké, perfect. Laat zien. Take it away. Thanks.
Let's see if this works. Ja, niet voor je.
Ja, dat is heel. Ja.
Oké, in dat geval, sorry dat ik dat vergeten. Ik kan ook niet printen van een laptop. Zo. Oké. Well, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to my final presentation for my thesis on value extraction software ecosystems.
If you ask me. Your rats was wings. I've been looking for his boy Nemo. Nemo? He was taken off the reef by divers and just. They're taking it heavy. Mine?
Well, I'll get back to that later. But for now, let's start with the content of my presentation. Essentially, this is going to be a very short, very high-level overview of my research project. Essentially, I'm going to give a very short introduction on what is software ecosystems and what do we consider to be value in software ecosystems. Well, essentially, as an introduction to my topic. Then discuss how that results in a conceptual model of how the world looks, according to me. Well, we. Discuss research questions, research approach, and finally, of course, results and the necessary validation steps. So let's start with a very short introduction on what software ecosystems are. Essentially, there's a definition that everyone follows by Slinger. Alpha software ecosystem is a set of businesses who work together or have some form of relationship other than selling to the same customers. So you can either exchange code or modules or documentation or leads or customers or whatever. And it's usually based on either a common platform, so PHP programming language, or the Ruby ecosystem, or a common market, that is financial software with all its bits and pieces and stuff. So based on this definition, there are a couple of ways we can look at software ecosystems. I'll discuss a few of them, or the most important ones. This is called a software ecosystem overview. Let's end it around. Anyway, we're looking here at the software vendor level, that is a single company or an independent software vendor with its relationships like products and services that are sold and other products and services and materials that are bought to create a software product. We can go a level up and look at the software supply network or software supply chain, which you consider the suppliers of your suppliers, etc., mostly for issues like stability and stuff like that. We can go even more one level up, of course, and look at the software ecosystem, in which you consider the entire ecosystem, which have some common basis, but not necessarily interact with each other. In practice, of course, if you start automatic modeling of the software ecosystem, that tends to get a whole lot bigger. This is an example of the complete Ruby ecosystem, for example, or modules, for those of us who study computer science. But the most important way, at least in my research project, we can look at software ecosystem is viewed by Jens T. and Veen, who discussed that there are essentially two roles in software ecosystem. You can either be a hub or a niche player. Niche players are small specialized companies that are, well, they operate in the software ecosystem that are not essential to the connections to the companies, etc. While hubs or keystones are the large companies that have a lot of shared connections who have a crucial role in keeping the ecosystem together. Some of the companies we consider hubs, you probably know, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, etc. Those are companies that would be prime examples of fulfilling hub roles in a lot of cases. Given this very short introduction to software ecosystems, what is actually value in software ecosystems? And what we mean by value is, why would you want to participate in a software ecosystem? What is the business value for you to gain from that ecosystem? Well, if you reconsider the crab and the seagulls operate as a group. If you eat the crab all on your own, essentially all your friends are going to die. So you're going to have to share that value. If you do not capture it, you're essentially going to run out and you're all going to starve. And this is more appropriate than you might consider the comparison, given the fact that a lot of early work in software ecosystems has been focused on comparing it to biological ecosystems. Biological ecosystems, for example, also have hub structures in which a single species is crucial to the survival of the ecosystem. What is value in software ecosystem? Why would you join? Well, we have a definition of business value, or we have a lot of them actually. This is the most comparable one. Any desirable result for a stakeholder in a context. Yeah, it's probably true. It's too vague to not be true, but it doesn't help us very much. For example, any desirable result, okay, what are those results? For a stakeholder, well, that can be the companies. In the context, is that the entire software ecosystem? Is that the way you operate in it? So, probably covers it, but it's not very useful. So this is one of the things we try to create in this project, that is create a better definition of value in the software ecosystem. We do have examples of value. For example, if you consider the App Store, there is some sort of value exchange here. Apple gains $99 a year per developer. I see we have subscription fee to enter the App Store, want to be able to build software for it. And it gains 30% from all sales, which is quite a lot of money in that case. But on the other hand, the developers gain value by participating in this App Store. For example, they gain the ability to use Apple's SDKs, documentation, and most importantly, to sell their product through the App Store to consumers and get it, well, in that way, the only way to their consumers to sell it. But there are also, for example, business-to-business solutions in which you can adopt other kinds of value. In one of the case studies, for example, a company built their software product on this Force.com platform. Is that a good idea? Well, you're locked into their platform, so if they change the rules, you're going to have to adapt. But on the other hand, it enables them to deliver software to market a lot faster than it would otherwise do, just by reusing common functionality and installed base, which they otherwise wouldn't have. So those are examples of what is business value, reasons for joining the software ecosystem. But it raises all sorts of questions like, how do I expect that value? How do I capture enough value for myself? How much should I expect? And, well, what are the ways in which I can do that? So, and ultimately, if you, if you think about how do I expect value from a software ecosystem, and the question, how much can I expect? I mean, I want to keep as much as possible money for myself. If I gain 70% of every app, sure, go ahead. But ultimately, that's going to make your ecosystem sustainable. There are three, the concept of software ecosystem health is an entire topic on its own, but it has three main determinants, which I'll quickly discuss. They're called robustness, which is essentially the resilience of the network in face of external threats. So if there is a new technology or a new change or some big company goes over, will the network survive as it is? Productivity, how efficient is the network in turning inputs into outputs as a whole? And niche creation, is there a space for niche players to grow and, well, have their own little protected little turf, not be encroached on by the bigger players? So those are the main concepts of health, software ecosystem health we consider. All this theoretical background, the first chapter of my thesis, comes together in a conceptual model, that is, how this all relates to each other in our view. This is the conceptual model. It's a little bit smaller than I expected. But essentially what you see here is that the software ecosystem has a number of actors, companies who fulfill a role, and it has health indicators, which I just discussed, which affect how healthy that software ecosystem is. But you also see that the software ecosystem contains forms of value, which are expected by its participants or added back to it, shared with others. And those actors influence, through their application of strategy, through their actions in the software ecosystem, influence how that value is moved, or who has that value or who hasn't. This is the, well, let's say landscape on which the thesis project is. But it raises questions, of course, where there are gaps in the existing scientific research. Those lead to research questions, which are, well, one, create a definition of value of the ecosystem, default definition. Two, find out which forms of value there actually are. Three, find out how can we extract those forms of value and how will our extraction affect the overall health of the software ecosystem, of the specific software ecosystem. So we can map those research questions directly onto the conceptual model and create an overview of, well, which areas of the existing literature would we like to contribute to or would we like to adapt. So you see that we create a definition and we try to, well, make this section of the conceptual model more clear. We can also map the project onto the MBI research framework, which you see here. It's an overview of all research areas that the master and the department are currently doing research in, which are our goals. And you see that this project will strongly relate to, well, either strategic management, how you make choices on how to extract value, a little bit on sales and services, of course, but mostly on the economy of the building software. So in that sense, even for business informatics, this is a rather high-level oriented topic. So, well, now that we have questions, of course, we need to answer those questions. So we need a research approach. Well, this is the research approach. I'm going to do, or I did actually, of course, a structured literature review of looking for forms of value, definition of value, then have some interviews with software companies to validate those, then finally create a strategic model, which is essentially a tool you can use to guide decisions of decision makers with regards to value. Finally validate that in some other way. Well, of course, that never happens. So, new plan. Through the project and through talking to other people at Exact and Singer and lots of other people, eventually you're going to reach a point where you're like, maybe we're looking at this the wrong way. The original concept is really, I'm an actor in a software ecosystem. I grab some value for myself and I share some value with others because I have to. But really the focus changes on how that value is exchanged, which is a, well, subtle change, same subject, well, somewhat different approach. And the new idea that business value is exchanged between companies in reciprocal fashion often, but could be different. We'll see examples of that. And you can affect those flows by making decisions and changing your strategy. For example, if you decide you want a larger share of the pie and simply will capture, let's say, 50% of all app sales, that's going to have an effect on your partners, but also on the wider ecosystem as a whole. And the core idea of this thesis is that we can model those changes in a graph, or a directed graph actually, and formally reason about them. So, new idea, new plan, of course. We're still conducting an SLR. We're now trying to find plays which are, well, in a military sense, more akin to tactics than to strategy. We're looking for concrete instances of policy in which you change the way your company operates in the software ecosystem. So it's more like we're going to have this fee set at 20%, and less like we'll have a product leadership strategy, or we'll do some cost cutting, so generic things. We'll develop those into graphs and ultimately validate those through the case study. And ultimately, well, it takes time, takes maybe a little bit longer than you would have wanted to. So ultimately, we're going to have to drop the fourth research question on health. It is included in the answer to the third research question, but it's not explicitly touched on or modeled or formally proven. So ultimately, in the scope reduction, we're going to have to drop that. So now that you know what I've actually done in the last 8 months, let's talk about results. And for starters, in conducting the literature review, we've quickly found out, well, the idea is to find in scientific literature instances of, well, business value in software ecosystems. I can't directly search for it because we've concluded that it doesn't exist, or not a concrete overview. We're trying to create that. But one of the things we can look at are business models. That is, how you sell your software, who pays for what, who gets what in exchange. And we can analyze those to gain an insight in what is actually the core value here, what's being paid for, what is exchanged. So we try to look at, oh, and important, what are the factors that influence the performance of those business models? So I've looked at that. We've gathered, based on these search terms, a whole lot of papers which were processed automatically, ultimately resulting in some technical rejections, that is, things that are not actually scientific papers, or even papers which had 0 citations, for example, were rejected. And ultimately, that's going to result in 123 papers, which I will read. It's a hell of a job, by the way. And well, the main, after creating a huge list of all forms and instances of value in that software ecosystem, we clustered those together and ultimately discovered that there are essentially 4 main reasons in scientific literature why you would join the software ecosystem. Split up into 2 levels. If we start at the top, the resource level, it is essentially the explanation of the fact that if a company has something you want, that's either customers, access to their customers, or customer data, you're going to have to play by their rules. That happens a lot, especially with larger companies. For example, the company at which I did a large part of my thesis project, Exact, is a major software company that sells financial software. There are a lot of smaller companies who small specialized tasks like employee data, etc., who use the APIs of Exact to send their data to the company and back. They're going to essentially, they are usually less than 100 employees, while Exact has over 1,800 employees, so they're essentially going to have to play by Exact rules. And on another level, you have 3 primary reasons in literature why you would join the software ecosystem, which are more, well, on a choice basis. You can choose to adopt them or not. That is either savings or improved effectiveness, which is actually rather simple and, well, kind of the complement of each other. That is, if you cooperate in this software ecosystem, you can do something faster or cheaper or better. Well, the example I talked about with Salesforce. But by far the largest reasons is complementary opportunities. And there are a huge number of those, which I won't be able to talk about today, all of them. But essentially, the overarching goal is to create, is to find a partner company that does something that is complementary, that adds to your product. For example, you could be building an open source project, or you could be selling hardware that is sold in conjunction with software. We'll see a case of that later. So that is actually the main form of value that we found, just create complementary opportunities. Based on that list, eventually we'll create a definition of a more useful definition of value software ecosystems, in the sense that any product service which is enabled or exchanged through software ecosystem and provides tangible benefit to some parties. So essentially, it is a definition of business value, but it's more scope to our subject. It has, and the key point here is the tangible benefit to participate. We've seen instances of value in business models in which there is, well, we consider it value in literature, but it's not really value. It's not really valued by a single participant. Like, is that value? That could be discussed. So, based on, well, essentially this provides the answer to the first definition and second research question on the list of values, and this is the final answer as it's appeared from the project. Moving on to the third research question, how is this value improved in the software ecosystem? We essentially adopted, or adapted, I should say, a existing method of software defined networks, which I told you in the beginning, but instead of labeling the flows with products and services, complete instances, we label them with business value, which could be broader, but it could also be that product. So let's talk about an example. This is divestment. It is essentially, suppose as a company you have a product that is no longer profitable, or you don't want it anymore, it's not part of your core focus, etc. You decide to move it, to abandon it. You call your customers and say, hey, we're not building this anymore. You don't have to pay anymore, just go away. But how does that work out for you? The answer, not so good. This is, by the way, based on a description from scientific literature that we have adapted into this model. Essentially what happens is the customer, assuming that he wants the value back, which can't be described earlier, assuming that the customer wants to keep using that product, he is going to need to replace that product. So your partner or another software vendor that sells the same product is going to, well, deliver that functionality to the customer and gain in return his revenue. And it's a simple sale of product. You, on the other hand, are gonna receive the value of having less functionality or less product, is maybe a better label. You don't need to support it, you don't need to build it, you don't need to maintain it. Essentially, you incur lower costs. You're also not going to have that revenue from the customer, so there's an exchange. Now, we can use this example as an example on how we can reason over these flows to determine whether this is actually a good idea, whether we can improve on this scenario or strategy to make a better scenario. And for that, we define a few assumptions and a few functions. Starting with the value function, which is the amount of business value that a participant derives from a flow. And if we consider a play as being net neutral, that is, as a rational actor, you will willingly participate in a scenario or a strategy if the value you receive out of that is larger than, well, the value you lose from it. Or, that's not completely correct, as I say it. Actually, if your inbound value is larger than your outbound value, you stand to gain something, therefore you'll be happy about it. Maybe a better formula. So we define the utility as of the partner, and assuming a precondition for joining is that the utility must be larger than 0, we can then evaluate this over what we've drawn. So the customer's value is switching costs, which is, well, not very likely to be appreciated because it's just costs. It doesn't really help you in any way. The utility of the partner or the other software vendor is revenue minus the cost of delivery of revenue. That is likely to be positive, otherwise why would you sell the product? There are some cases in which you sell a product as a loss leader, of course, in which you sell the product without reclaiming the full cost at the start. But essentially this is, in normal cases, should be positive. So how can we improve upon this? Well, for starters, we could, for example, work together with another software vendor in this case and say, hey, I'm going to give you the data of my customers. I'm going to go to all my customers and say, hey, if you want to, I'll send my data to this other software vendor who delivers a similar product, and you can, well, continue business as usual on this different and similar product. That will reduce, we assume, to 0 switching cost of the customer, and it gains you, if those partners pay you per customer, for example, a lead fee. Now, there are a lot of things that are not included here, given it's a theoretical scenario, of course. For example, you'll need to find a partner that's actually willing to participate, etc. And it doesn't consider the fact of competition, for example, the basic fact. But essentially, it shows it's the shortest example I have of how you can apply these graphs, this reasoning, on how to, well, marginally improve one of these strategies. There are a number of limitations that are apparent from these strategies that we drew. I think there are 13 of them in paper, which I won't be discussing all for obvious reasons. That is essentially that to start with the list of values, that is incomplete. A lot of things were found in the scientific literature, but I can think of a few things that I personally am aware of that are not in there. Could have added those, but that creates problems in the chain of evidence, of course. But essentially, this list is always going to be with respect to what forms of value you have found. Finally, second, it's very hard to determine where you draw your boundaries on where you stop drawing your flows and boundaries. And it depends on the story you want to tell in large parts, which is, well, not really a hard cut, as I may say so. Thirdly, the value function is the appreciation that another partner or yourself gives to a form of value. And in some cases, you can use that for formal reasoning. For example, if I give you $10 and myself $10, we're likely to appreciate that in the same function. But even that is not true in all cases. For example, if you have a company on the verge of bankruptcy, it's highly likely to value profits over revenue. While if you have a company that wants to grow, it's likely to value revenue over profits. It's both money and the same amounts, but it's not appreciated in the same way. So, and coupled with the fourth point, the application of formal reasoning overflows tends to create, in my opinion, little insight. It usually determines things in formulas that you could have followed yourself or some other way. So in that sense, is this part of the project that I think does not add very much. but it has created, in some cases in my thesis, minor interesting insights. Let's just put it that way. So, while this proves or shows that we can use this form of drawing and graph drawing to reason about theoretical scenarios, we also like to know if it applies in practice. So essentially what we did, we have a question.
Oh, it's a problem.
Sure,
I
that's
have
great.
a question.
So essentially what we did, we took 10 companies and asked them, well, will you describe how your company works, what do you sell, and how do you participate with other customers, or with customers and with other companies to create your product? That was then drawn in Vega and sent back without any further explanation to that company and say, or to the person I was interviewing and say, hey, what do you think of this drawing? Does this accurately reflect your point? I have a couple here. I'll discuss a few of them, not all, unfortunately. This is a company, Datafox Benelux. It is a reseller of hardware that it buys from a German company, which is independent. And essentially, it pays for that terminal hardware. It makes terminals you can use for smart cards. And it receives in return, well, those terminals. But it also helps its German company to not have to expense of reaching the market in the Netherlands. It sells that hardware to software vendors who use it together with their software to create an integrated product bundle, which is then sold to customers. And occasionally, it sells it to them directly. This already creates or makes apparent two problems in using this approach, in the sense that this is largely a supply chain. Products are exchanged for money. So there's very little value in drawing it this way over, well, drawing a traditional software supply network. So it's not really applicable to supply chains. Another weak point that was apparent from the evaluation from this paper is that this flow is through software vendors accounts for 90% of the business. Only very rarely does the business sell directly to consumers. So the main point in feedback was, this is not as important. Should it be removed? Well, maybe we could discuss about that. Another example which is more appropriately modeled in a software or in a value exchange graph is a startup called Ghost. It builds software for it builds a platform for consumers to be reminded of when their contracts expire. So if your contract expires in 6 months, you're going to after 5 months you're going to get an email. Hey, if you want to cancel and get a better deal, you need to do so now. That product is supplied to customers, well, for free, and Ghost earns its money, as do all comparison sites, largely on the kickbacks that are that it gets when new contracts are made with service, which are largely with these two suppliers who also supply data on what contracts are made. Additionally, it works together with either one of these three partners, which is known at this time which one it's going to be. It's a startup after all, to resell its products to its competitors, or to resell its products to the market base of these larger societies, and in return, well, currently they're still in negotiation. In the interest of time, I won't talk about these two. So essentially, the results of the validation phase boil down to this. There is a general agreement on correctness, in the sense that if you give someone this drawing of a situation based on an interview of an hour, and you ask, is this an accurate depiction, without any added explanation, they usually tend to say yes, and they usually tend to understand what it's about. Some corrections apply. It's not very suitable for the development of supply chains. Well, it's kind of obvious. That's especially there are two companies I think that turned out to be, well, regular supply chains. It works, but you could better use something else. And finally, the choices on what you depict, and this is I think the main weak point of the approach. The choices on what to depict, what to include, how many competitors, how many flows, what is relevant to your story, is highly dependent on what you want to say and what you want to tell. There's not one true way. I consider that somewhat of a weak point. So, but ultimately, it's going to produce an accurate picture of your software ecosystem in that sense. So, conclusion of the entire project, before we run out of time. We've essentially discovered a definition of value in software ecosystems. We've created a list or an overview of what the main forms of value are, but that's always going to be incomplete. We've also created a modeling technique for predicting those relationships, but that has some caveats. It's not usually universally applicable, and it's very dependent on the context in which you go. And finally, we defined some form of formal reasoning, but the end value is, well, I would say such. So, mixed bag of results, I would say. But it does conclude the main part of my presentation, just in time, as I see, with the main results or the main answers to the research questions. I'd like to thank you all for your attention. I do have time for questions now, or never.
Four.
For you too. You've seen one. I've seen one. You can have three. But yeah, no. Let's go ahead for the questions. I usually like to split this in two. That is, first, clarification questions, if anything was unclear or requires elaboration. And second, well, discussion questions or opinions that you'd like to defend, that you'd like me to defend, etc. Oh, which I have, of course, very important. I'll also turn this on.
This was a PhD defense you could bring to the press as well.
Yeah, I'm aware. Let me just get this. Stop. People can see me again. Anything that needs clarification? That was unclear. That I skipped over.
One question about a specific slide. It was a slide with the values, and then the question is about the company that had to change from supplier, and there were costs for that. Do you know which slide I meant?
This one, I think.
Yeah, the previous one.
This one.
No, one thing.
This one.
No. maybe it was from you.
Oh, this one,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
this one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have a question because the utility for the customer is equal to the value of the switching cost. So that means that the value can be negative. Or not? Is that how should that be?
I tell you,
Is the value always constant or is it something negative?
No, it can also be negative. For example, in this case, it is considered to be a negative value. It is, recall, the appreciation you have on the value. For example, well, in this case, the long story is that we consider the products to be equivalent. So this value exchange is neutral with respect to this value exchange.
Yeah.
So the customer only incurs switching costs. But it is the appreciation of the switching costs, which, well, if you have to incur switching costs, the switching costs are costs you must make to, well, switch to another product. It doesn't help you in any way. So the appreciation of the customer here is negative.
Exactly.
It is something that we discussed, I think, in the process of which whether we should explicitly model that and have a minus sign, for example.
Yeah, it was
to make it more clear.
But,
However, that created some problems of its own, and it's well, ultimately we're stuck with this. Well, obviously because it's any other clarification questions?
Yeah, so
Any other picture of the source?
yeah, the story is really very. But can you go to the definition of value?
Oh wait, this was a good question. So you gain a bonus Dilbert. That's important.
Oh, it's supposed to be the
No bonus. Good. Well, there is room for other questions because we have other bonus Dilberts. But you wanted to see the definition. Definition. You should have seen this before.
Yeah. You're so right, but I just realized, what's the goal of any company?
What's the goal of any company? Well, ultimately, that depends. It's not making money because Amazon doesn't. For example,
One day.
I doubt it. That's not.
No,
The goal of any company is to continue to exist. And that helps them to do, well, whatever it is they wanted to do. In the case of Amazon, that is offering a cheap product, but it's definitely not making money. In some sense, it's about actors in the software ecosystem, not so much companies, in the sense that, for example, the BNF, the World Nature thing, or any good rule. Could be yeah, good goal, thanks. Yeah. Could also be actors in some ecosystem.
Or is revenue not valuable?
Revenue could be, I think, considered an artifact. I think I named it an artifact in my thesis, but that's a bit of a cop-out because anything can be considered an artifact, of course. But I think the most appropriate cover is a right. Revenue, as in it entitles you to, your code flow entitles you to have some form of payment. You could include it. Name it money, maybe. Even revenue is a, revenue or turnover is not what you exchange through a software ecosystem. Turnover is what you gain by exchanging money or payments through the software ecosystem, and the sum of that forms your revenue. Hope that answers your question. You also gain a bonus Dilbert, of course.
Yes.
Let's have this one. It must be very weird for people who are listening in all locations. They can't see the Dilbert. Turn the Dilbert back on. That's the one. Let me turn back on the Dilbert. Share this. So now everyone can see the bonus Dilbert. Any other questions? I still have 10 minutes or so.
I have one question about the concept of ecosystem as such.
Okay.
We know that other areas, biological areas, rather complex situations of organisms working together, living together. You use the concept of directed ground truth model ecosystem. So it seems that you are able to model quite complex situations of owners, partners, and customers, and perhaps even relationships between partners. But the examples show more or less supply chains, star like things in the middle of partners around it. So my question is perhaps because of the literature is changes in star. Might it be possible that the concept of these legal things, which is I think is more applicable to organized structures as well, or perhaps even more applicable to that.
I think, if I got your question correctly, it's about whether we can use this to model a complete ecosystem, with regard, except as opposed to how we now do it with a single company center. That is a bit vague, I realized in my presentation, but ultimately the answer is yes, of course you can do it. However, it tends to grow. In other examples, this method of labeling flows with sometimes rather vague labels tends not to grow very well beyond 6 arrows and 5 companies. After that, it gets very confusing on what happens, which you saw with the DataFox case, in which you include a number of graphs that are formally not. Where is it? Here it is. In which you include a number of lines. Always wanted to do this. For example, which could have been removed, or maybe should have been removed. And there are other cases in which there are some discussion on which lines to include. Yes, of course, you can model these through entire ecosystems, for example, by including the vendors of these companies and their suppliers and their customers. tends to get very messy after a few instances, and mostly how we've studied them in this project relates especially strong to the actions you take and how that changes the flows in one of these software ecosystems. And therefore, we take the central actor as the one who executes the strategy, usually in the middle of the knowledge. So yes, it could be done. There's nothing that stops it from being done, though it tends to get complicated fast. And if you get to the level of automated analysis, for example, this one, which was obviously automatically generated from code, I don't think it's going to be available or possible very soon, in 2 or 3 years, to be able to do this on this level, because it requires, well, business value largely requires interpretation, and as I said, it depends on what story you're trying to tell and who analyzes which company and how familiar you are with the company. And this is a software ecosystem that is built on code. It's simply read the code and determine the specifications of it, which is easier to do in this fashion than having a computer interpret relationships between companies or users. Hope that answers your question.
I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's most right into my own research again. So maybe I mean, sorry if I...
No, sure, go ahead.
I have one question that has a lot to do with this graph also, and also with that question.
For the record, this is not my graph.
Yeah,
This is my graph. You know that, but just that's not confusing. Yeah. No, it's another research project.
But my question is, can these values be mined? Can we mine values or can we mine edges in those?
In a sense that you use some form of automated analysis to determine where these flows flow.
Like some form of automated analysis, scraping or survey or yeah.
Well, your obvious problems for scraping are: what is your source? A, what is your source? B, can you get it? And C, processing, ETL. Yeah, been there in some projects. I think your first problem is going to be that these interviews took roughly an hour of talk about what other partners have you, and usually something pops up at the end, or even in the validation phase, like, oh yeah, we also have this. We can talk about it. Okay, what do you have? A useful source could be websites, but well, that's marketing material. So we treat these entire industries, and honestly, I actually tried to do that at some point. That is comparing 2 websites of 2 companies that actually do, that were different, who had exactly the same website. Everybody screams, I'm doing this and this and this, and you support your company, who you are. No, you don't want to turn off anyone on your website for talking. So using that as a source, you could do that, but it's largely very inaccurate. The other source could be
and the level of that actually is value.
I can think of a few reasons, mostly related to my capital sector, another project we did together on why that's never going to work in a million years. But it's mostly going to be very, very inaccurate. We create scalable solutions. I think that's going to be pretty hard. I think in that case, we get one more bonus Dilbert, of course, for the last 2 good questions. Where is it?
We have time for one more question for the audience, and then I'd like to start the round.
Well, Jakob, thank you for your presentation. And I may have, in your eyes, some stupid question, but please help me out. Just a simple naval architect being trained. We give a whole method of describing an ecosystem and finding value. My question is more on what's, very bluntly put, what's the point? Who uses or who will use a method like this? Are companies actually studying their ecosystem around them in this way, or is it maybe more about useful from an academic point of view?
Both, of course. This project is awesome. But apart from that, apart from that, it's a very good question, and it is useful in an academic way because it allows us a structured way of thinking about how, well, value, back to the word again, about why you would cooperate in the software ecosystem, something that from important prior work, like the software spy networks, if you model, for example, take for example the case of Exact, the company which works in numbers, which is a software vendor that makes employee software for administration of your employee relationships. Exact offers the same functionality. So if you draw this in a software spy network, it doesn't fit. Why would Exact work together with numbers, which they obviously do, to sell essentially the same functionality or a larger set of functionality, which includes numbers, to their customers? So that doesn't work. There's something missing there that is apparent when you draw it in the, or that becomes visible when you draw it in the value exchange graph. So in that sense, it is of academic importance. Is it of business importance? Yes and no. Yes, for the same reasons. It can be used to provide a different perspective on your own ecosystem. We've used it actually Exact to show that. On the other hand, I have to say it's tightly related to a number of systems that are already out there, which are included in my thesis references, but I can't talk about them all here. Things like business of innovation model, or the more famous, yeah, that one. That's the business model canvas. The thing you probably see with seven columns that focuses on the same aspects. In that sense, this is something I created, well, on my own in 8 months. And I would honestly, I have to say, it's not that applicable, or it's not as good, or as all through as some of those systems who have been in place for years have become. So in that sense, it adds something. You could use it, but there are other systems basically used. But essentially, it provides a way to paint a different picture both for practice in academia of your software ecosystem that was not apparent in, for example, software spy. I hope that answers your question. So before I ramble off on some other subject, I do have, because we have to wrap up at some point, or actually at some point is in 10 minutes. I do have the last bonus, Dilbert, for you, of course. This one. It's also the best one. Already stole this one. Well, then I thank you again all for coming. I'd like to thank again your panel. I'll kill feet now and guess it's Joshua again.
Shall we thank our questions?
No, damn it!
All right. So Jakob, well, congratulations. This is